Hello and welcome to Voices United, hosted by United Way of Lancaster County. I'm Joel Janisewski, Vice President of Impact, and I'm glad that you're with us today. United Way of Lancaster County works to advance education, economic mobility, and health of our community by mobilizing resources, people, and organizations. And Voices United brings community leaders to the table to discuss key issues in our community related to those issues around education, economic mobility, and health. Our goal is to bring people together to talk about things that matter to our community, to share information, to share knowledge and wisdom, and to help provide a path forward to bettering the lives of everybody in our community. We're thrilled that you're with us today. Today's conversation is about creating a trauma-resilient community. And our format for our time together over the next hour is that we'll start with a brief presentation, and then it'll be followed by a 45-minute moderated roundtable conversation. For the audience joining us today, that you can use the Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar to raise questions and over the course of our conversation, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Lots of times with the number of questions we get, we can't quite get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Also, I'd like you to know that we'll be sending a follow-up email later this week with links to recordings of this conversation on YouTube and Spotify, and we'll also include links to resources that get mentioned over the course of our time and conversation today. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that our discussion today will be covering trauma and may touch on accounts of struggle, harm, and other kinds of challenging experiences. So please take care of yourself and utilize available resources if needed. Know that it's okay to step away from the conversation, to take a break, and also, please reach out to friends and professionals for support. With that, I'd like to have our panel go around and briefly introduce yourself. And I'd like to invite Dr. Karen Rice to start that, please.
Thank you, Joel. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. My name is Dr. Karen Rice. I am Chair and Professor of the School of Social Work at Millersville University. Do you want me to popcorn to someone else?
Sure, that'd be great. Please do.
Okay, Jessica.
Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. I'm Jessica Purdy. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Director of Human Relations for Lancaster County Chooses Love, formerly Lidditz Chooses Love. And let's see, how about I pass this over to Amer?
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amer Fayadh. I'm the founder and CEO of Communication Essentials, a social enterprise in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I will pass it on to Kelly.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Haines, and I'm a police social worker with Lancaster City Police. I will popcorn to Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, even though it's beautiful outside. I am the client care manager at the Lancaster County Food Hub. I think there's just one of us left, so I think, Alex, you're it.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Alex Rohrer. I am the community school director at Burrowes Elementary in the city of Lancaster, and I'm also an adjunct instructor at Wilmington University. And thanks for being here on this beautiful day. I know the weather's beautiful outside. You might hear some kids in the background from the school I'm at. They're just enjoying recess in this beautiful weather. So I'm going to kick off with our presentation this morning. So one of the practices we like to do in the school is to do kind of a check-in with students and adults just to see where they're feeling. And one of the tools that we use is this mood meter. So this was adapted from Dr. Mark Brackett's work and the Yale Institute. So on it, you'll see that there's a level of energy on the left-hand side. So low energy at the bottom, higher energy at the top, and then an unpleasantness scale or pleasantness scale at the bottom. And then the colors also kind of help you a little bit. So that blue feeling, the green feeling, yellow area, and the red area. So this is really helpful for children, but also adults. And you can see that there's vocabulary there, but for those students who may not have the words yet, they might just be checking in a color. But as adults, I think it even gives some of us different words than just, how are you doing today? And you get the good, the dreaded good response that kind of means everything. So if anybody wants to share how they're feeling in the chat with everybody else, just a brief check-in, and we'll get started. I'll leave that up there just for a couple more seconds just so you can kind of grab a word if there's one that sticks out to you. And I'll check in myself just verbally. I'm feeling very thoughtful right now, so lower energy, but a decent amount of pleasantness. And I'm excited to be here with this conversation. So, all right. See a lot of people putting that in there. Thank you all for doing that. It's really good just to kind of check in with yourself to see where you're feeling, where you want to be is another question that you might ask yourself. So while you're in the blue, maybe you're okay staying in the blue today, but maybe you want to go to the yellow or the green as well. There's no wrong emotions, and that's what we teach the kids as well. But sometimes you want to change throughout the day. So the presentation this morning, I'm just going to briefly talk about community trauma and resilience pieces, which kind of aligns with the topic that we're focused on here today. So just some disclaimers. I know Joel mentioned some of these in the beginning, that talking about trauma can be a really heavy conversation. It is something that a lot of people have had experience with in some form. And it's really important to take care of yourself, even in a virtual space. You might need to turn your, I would say turn your camera off. We're in a webinar format. So just turning away from the computer, walking away, taking a drink of water or something near you, and playing with a fidget, whatever it takes to kind of help yourself in this moment. Trauma is a really complex topic, which means there's a lot to unpack. And in an hour-long webinar, we can't really unpack all of that. However, we're going to do our best to kind of talk a little bit about it here in this presentation, as well as during the panel conversation as well. But we need to be realistic, and this conversation could probably take weeks if we wanted to spread it out and to touch on everything that we are interested in. Another piece is that a lot of people in this space are very well versed in this. So those of you that are attending this, not just the panelists, you've worked with trauma and resilience in your own personal life or professional life. And a lot of you have had great experience in terms of how to best address that. So a lot of you are well versed in this topic. And so some of it might be a review, some of it might be brand new for you. So what is trauma? It's always, where we start is a definition or an understanding from the very beginning. So trauma there has to be something that happens, right? There's an event that happens. The difference, though, is it doesn't have to actually cause the fear of death, or the risk of death does not have to be possible. It's just that person has to fear that negative outcome. So it could be a serious physical or emotional injury or death. It doesn't actually have to happen. It just has to be perceived. And then there has to be a person, right? So it's kind of the whole idea of if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, if no one has experienced or witnessed or heard about that event, then there won't be a trauma result of that unless somebody is hearing from it or hearing about it from somebody else or some other method. So they are experiences or situations. They do cause emotional pain or distress. And one of the biggest things is they overwhelm your ability to cope. So we all have different levels of coping, and it is very individualized. So if somebody is not able to cope with a certain situation, that is enough to say that this could be a trauma for them, whereas it might not be a trauma for somebody else. A lot of the times people will express this feeling of powerlessness or loss of control. So if you ask someone after the fact, how they were feeling, they might have felt like they didn't have control of the situation, that they didn't have control of what was going to happen. And then I just put this quote in here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's talking about the frequency of them. So they're not extraordinary because they occur rarely, but it's more so because they are extraordinary because they overwhelm our abilities to adapt to different components. So, I think there's just been a couple things in the last 25 years that have happened, just a few things. And I'm just putting the last 25 years here. These are things locally, as well as statewide, as well as national. I had actually just updated this the other day with the plane crash that unfortunately happened right outside the Lancaster airport. But this is just to say there are so many things that are happening at so many different levels that not only the people that we're serving in our roles are addressing and handling, but also us as professionals are also addressing these things in our personal lives. We're exposed to them through the media more than ever. And so these are things that we're showing up with as professionals, not only the people that we're serving. And again, this is just the last 25 years. So if anybody in the room is, older than 25, you've experienced even more of this. So when we talk about trauma, one of the things that can come up is how do you kind of put it on a spectrum, or how do you identify it? And one of the concepts that came in the training I was in was talking about it as big T or little t. So the perception of the event is, was this an event that was non-traumatic for you, or was it very traumatic for you? So that's how you're perceiving the event. The actual degree is what it impacts you. So little t would be, it's a minor impact in your life. It didn't really change much of what is going on for you. It didn't really change any routines. You may have only processed it for a little bit and you've moved on. If it's a big T, it's deeply impactful. It might change your whole life, right? You might have to move out of your house. If you think like of a natural disaster, a hurricane, maybe that would maybe cause you to have to move out of your house. It could make you move out of the state, even depending on how you're able to address that afterwards. So this degree of trauma is just something that helps you understand how much is it impacting that person's life. And with this, I just want to bring up a little image here. So typically when I bring up this image of goldfish, a lot of people are thinking, a loss of a goldfish could be a trauma because we lose. Goldfish, unfortunately, are not the most long-living pets or the most resilient. However, for goldfish, that's often a kid's first loss, right? So a pet, right? So if they're losing that pet, I saw someone put Ted Lasso, has nothing to do with Ted Lasso. But the loss of a pet is often the first traumatic experience for a child. And for them, if the worst thing that's happened to them is the loss of their goldfish at that point, then that is the worst thing that happened to them. So we're not saying as an adult, well, that's not a big T moment. Because for us, we have so many other things that we're playing and putting into context. But for that child, if that's the worst thing that's happened to them so far, then that's what we're going to accept is that's their big T right now. Another thing with trauma is it is taking adaptive behaviors, and this came up earlier in that quote, it is taking adaptive behaviors, but it's turning them into maladaptive. So if you look at this Arctic fox here, if this Arctic fox is in the North Pole, South Pole, where there is still snow, this fox would blend in really well, right? We may not see it. It might survive really well in its environment. That behavior or that adaptation is very helpful for it. However, if you move that fox out of the North Pole or the South Pole into, let's say, Pennsylvania today, it would stand out really like a lot, right? So that white fox is no longer blending in with its background. It's standing out. So that adaptation that it had in that moment is now actually not helpful for it. It's actually harmful to it. and it's causing it to be at more risk. So this adaptation, thinking of child behaviors at home, right? So they might adapt to certain things at home. So they might have to hide because there's something traumatic happening at the home. If they try to hide at school, that might be seen as a bad behavior or something that shouldn't be happening in the classroom, but they've learned that behavior to cope with what is going on for them at home. Speaking of childhood trauma, so ACEs is a conversation that comes up a lot of the time when we talk about trauma, and especially with children. So it is not the 4 ACEs being the 4 ACEs in a card deck, but I really like this graphic because it expands among or further than just the original, ACEs that we typically discuss. So the adverse childhood experiences. So those are in the middle of the tree here. And it adds on these other factors because a lot of the conversation today will be about community trauma and community resilience. So it does go outside of just what's happening inside the home. You have things like adverse climate experiences. So COVID-19 is considered one of those. So every single person that's alive today has experienced COVID-19, right? That's already an ACE in that sense. We also have adverse community experiences. So these are things in the lower parts of the tree, the roots of the tree. These are things that feed up into and may contribute to some of the adverse childhood experiences. So that poverty and violence happening in the community, the lack of resources or lack of social capital happening out in the community. Those are things that might contribute to some of those adverse childhood experiences. And then you have things even further down. So the atrocious cultural experiences. These are things that are feeding into the tree. These are settings. These are bigger than just a community. So the best example here would be maybe segregation. So this happening, that fed into some of those root causes in adverse community experiences, which then leads up into the adverse childhood experiences. So it's kind of this multi, systems level view of adverse childhood experiences rather than just focusing on those ones that are in the home. Another analogy that might come up when you're talking about trauma is the iceberg. So a lot of the time when we're thinking of trauma, you have those outward behaviors, those things that people are displaying. That's all we can go off of, right? In that moment is what we're seeing, hearing from them. However, we have to understand that there's things going on below the surface. So their emotional health is impacted by that trauma and their relational health. So the emotional health being things like their self-esteem, how they view themselves. And then their relational health is how do they relate to other people? How do they work with other people? So trust is a big one that comes up. Trust is impacted deeply when you're traumatized, especially when there's another person. So just like these traumatic events may involve 2 people, the healing process also then to heal parts of these iceberg is also involving people. Another way to think about trauma is it changes the person's view of the world. So they may view the world completely different. And the easiest simplification of this is they may view it no longer as safe, right? So they've experienced this trauma and now they're saying, I cannot leave my house, or I cannot leave my neighborhood, or I cannot leave my city, whatever it may be, because of something that they've experienced. So it changes how they view all of this. They may view people differently. The other thing with this is they may not be aware that this is happening. So they may not recognize why. Now when they go to, we'll use a local example of a Stormers game and the fireworks are going off, they may not understand why they're having a negative reaction to those sounds, but it might be related to them experiencing gun violence in their neighborhood, right? Those loud noises may have been associated with that experience. So it literally changes our perception. So this, I just put this image of here and I'll rotate it for you so you don't have to rotate your own head. But from one angle, this may look like a duck. From another angle, it may look from a rabbit. It is the same image, but that perception of us can be adjusted just by the words that I'm saying. So if I said quack for the first one, that might get you to think duck quicker than if I say hop, that might get you to think rabbit quicker. So just some of these triggers or cues may help us, may help your perception change. And the same thing goes with trauma impacts. So that's talking about the person impacted by trauma, their lens shifting, but us as professionals or anyone working with folks that are traumatized or been trauma exposed, we need to shift our perspectives too, or our lenses, from the idea of what is wrong with this person to what happened to them, right? Because if they're doing something good, you wouldn't say, well, why, like, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing that good behavior? You would say, what happened that you've gotten to this point? You know, what helped you achieve that gold medal? You'd be asking those questions in a non-judgmental way of just figuring out, you know, what led to this success. The same thing is if things are not going so well. You know, we shouldn't be approaching it with what is wrong with you? Why are you doing this? It's more about what happened. What is the context of this situation? So a real quick quote from me, just trauma is not excusing behaviors, it explains it. And this comes up a lot in schools just because, you know, there are consequences to behaviors, whether we're children or adults. But it's not excusing the behavior. It's not saying that what you did doesn't have consequences. It's just saying, here's some context for you to take into consideration when you're looking at those behaviors. So shifting into resilience, just real quick. I just made a play on words here, resilience, because actually the original term resilience wasn't related to social or behavioral things. It was actually for ecosystems and being talked about in the 1970s about how forests can actually just survive long periods despite all of the threats that happen to a forest. If you think of all the different things they have to endure, so the weather, but also things like natural disasters or not so natural, like a wildfire being human created. All of the different pests that might involve destruction of the forest. They have to endure so many different things, yet forests overall tend to stay around and regrow and reforest themselves or retree themselves. So with resilience, it's actually the rule. It's not the exception when we're talking about it. So a lot of people think that resilience might be this rare thing that only a couple people kind of have tapped into or have this skill. But resilience actually in a lot of the research has been found to be the majority. So about 55% to 85% of people who have experienced trauma are showing these resilience signs. And these resilience signs mean that those symptoms and distress outcomes are kept to a lower extent, even over time. So it just happened, even a year later, 2 years later, those symptoms, those negative outcomes are kept down. You see the other numbers are a lot smaller. That doesn't mean that we ignore them and say that they're not important. We are addressing those. Those are, you know, we might have treatment providers that are handling some of those chronic situations of someone with PTSD in that upper level. Some of the people might have delayed responses where it doesn't actually spike until 2 years later. So we do have services for that. We have treatment, we have providers with that. This is just to highlight the idea that resilience is very common in a lot of folks. That doesn't mean that every single person has the same level of resilience. Some of that might be our role to support, and that'll probably come out in our conversation today as the panel. And some of the things, there's skills that are related to it that may boost resilience as well. So we have to think of resilience not only from an individual standpoint, but also these larger groups. And I had saw that someone put in the chat earlier, you know, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems. So thinking about these different levels. So we do look at the individual, you know, how are they perceiving themselves? How is the trauma to them, as well as the resiliency factors? However, we have to look at, you know, that person lives in a context, right? They live with other people. They live in a community, they live in a city, they live in a county, they live in a state. They live with all of these other institutions that they're handling or working with. You know, maybe their children are in school, they themselves are working, and they have some medical conditions that they're working with the hospital on something else with treatment. So they have to interact with all these different institutions on a daily basis. And then we have policies that are in place, right? These are things that may make it easier or harder for folks to be resilient in the outcome of a trauma. With the flexibility mindset, so this is something that came up in George Bonanno's book, The End of Trauma. So this in my slides here, if you're interested in checking that book out. He talks about the flexibility mindset. So this is kind of that like what are some traits or skills that folks that have a little bit more resilience are demonstrating. So optimism about the future specifically, and then a shift in viewing the threat as a challenge versus this end all be all trauma, right? So if they're viewing it as something they have to overcome, or viewing it as something that they have the ability to address with help, it doesn't have to be by themselves, that can also assist with their resilience. And then this last piece is the confidence in their own ability to cope. So how confident are they in their own ability to cope with this trauma? Again, that can be boosted through some of the support through other folks in the room. So I know that was a lot in 10 to 15 minutes. But again, like I said, this is a very complex topic, and we could spend weeks and weeks on this, but I'm excited to hear what the questions are for the panel, and how we can talk about this important topic further. Thank you.
Alex, thank you for laying the groundwork and laying the foundation for our discussion. You've given us a lot to think about already. Thank you. Yeah, so I want to start with a question to the panel in general, that why is it important for our community to focus on building resilience in both individuals and in our collective community spaces?
I think I'll start us off then.
Thanks, Jessica.
I think the reason that it's important to the queer community is because so many of us have experienced or are experiencing traumas. Traumas like family rejection, religious exclusion, and religious attacks, political attacks, and right now especially, like the anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric, which is so prominent in our public discourse. This really affects every member of the LGBTQ plus community. It affects our families, it affects our allies. And so, having that resilience both as a person personally and in community spaces is essential to our ability to weather the challenges that we're facing, both personally and collectively. And without that resilience, our lives disintegrate, our communities disintegrate.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I'll just expand upon what Jessica stated, so I appreciate that, because I think one of the things that Alex said that I want to highlight is that trauma affects each person individually, right? It's a unique experience. And so our goal when helping individuals respond to that trauma, right, is to foster that post-traumatic growth, right? And it's really, when we talk about resilience, it's really the ability to adapt and move forward after that traumatic event. But yet, and the traumatic event is personalized, but then we are within communities, organizations that also might perpetuate trauma that we've experienced or trigger the trauma that we experience. And so the importance of creating these trauma resilient communities or workplaces, right, is to help individuals cope and manage with those emotions and those thoughts and those behaviors that are a result of the trauma that they experienced. And so then ultimately we're creating individuals and supporting and developing and enhancing, right, those individuals within our workplaces and within our communities to improve, overall emotional well-being, reduce some of the behaviors that might be perceived as negative behaviors within workplaces. And so if we focus on mitigating those harmful effects from the trauma, then we are supporting the individuals within our communities to be healthier individuals.
I want to turn to a question to you that you work in a unique space at the intersection between law enforcement and community mental health. How can police departments integrate trauma-informed practices to support community members, and especially in their time of crisis?
Yeah, so one way police departments can integrate these practices is through training and education. Officers should be trained to understand the impact of trauma and how it can present. Training on how officers can de-escalate crisis situations by recognizing triggers and utilizing calming strategies can prevent crisis situations from escalating. Ways our department is currently integrating these practices are by having officers that are CIT trained. This stands for Crisis Intervention Team. This is a 40-hour course that reviews how to identify and respond to mental health crises. All of our officers are also required to take annual trainings related to mental health. My partner Grace and I are also part of facilitating these trainings with officers. And then lastly, as police social workers, our role is to help foster a trauma-informed approach while working alongside law enforcement by offering a different lens of intervention, as we are specifically trained in mental health and crisis intervention. Part of our role is to help bridge the gap between police officers and community members. With our understanding of mental health and trauma, we can advocate for efforts that align law enforcement practices with community well-being. And then by integrating trauma-informed practices and collaborating with social workers, police departments can respond to crisis situations more effectively by reducing harm and fostering trust within the community. This approach not only improves the well-being of individuals involved, but also enhances the public safety by providing more compassionate and comprehensive support to those in need that we're serving.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for so much foundational information. Can you tell us a little bit, like in your day-to-day work, like what that might look like?
Yeah, so my partner Grace and I, we support the community with any needs that they have getting connected to social services. So if an officer encounters someone that, there's an incident that is non-criminal in nature, that's where Grace and I can be helpful and see if there's any appropriate referrals that might be needed.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Rebecca, in your work with the Lancaster County Food Hub, and work day-to-day work focused on addressing food insecurity, are there specific strategies that you've seen that help make that make access to food like in a more trauma-informed way, in a way that provides better healing care for individuals?
Absolutely. I think reducing the crisis response mentality that I think that we've all sort of been in, well, as Alex shared, for 25 years plus, right? Just recycling back and forth from that crisis response to one that's focused on prevention that can then reduce the trauma of food insecurity. Offering regular food support and community resources that prevent hunger from escalating into a crisis creates a sense of security and stability. Also, ensuring that food resources are available consistently rather than just in times of crisis helps reduce that anxiety and uncertainty that can come with not knowing when their next meal is coming from. Consistency definitely reduces trauma associated with food insecurity.
Yeah, like do you have an example of one specific step that the Food Hub's taken in working with the community in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of similar to what Kelly had said, as a social service agency, bringing in other partners that have different types of resources, advocating for things like SNAP benefits and the freedom of choice for that type of thing. And honestly, just being a resource. Where are things available? How does that fit into the schedule of our community and our neighbors? That's something that we're specifically focused on here, making sure that we share all of the great resources that are here in this community.
Thanks. Amer, I want to pose a question to you in your work with communication essentials, and that your organization provides a wide range of services around consulting and language interpretation. And how do you ensure that the services you provide are trauma informed?
Thank you very much for the question, Joel. I will say the base to be in trauma-informed organization or to the services that I provide is language justice. And language justice refers to the practices that organization put in place to ensure that their services are linguistically and culturally appropriate for the communities that they served. I come from I'm a resettled individual, so I was resettled in South Central Pennsylvania. I worked with resettled individuals for almost 10 years, and my job was mainly to help individuals access services. So I got to experience the challenges to access some services in some instances back then. And that led me to the work that I'm doing currently with language justice and with communication essentials. We started as an interpretation and translation agency, but I realized early on that education and advocacy is a key component to ensure that people have appropriate access to services. And that's why when we start focusing more on engagement organization that we work with, engaging our partners by providing training to their staff, explain to them what language justice look like in practice, helping them to help our community, access services with dignity and also in an appropriate way, given the historical and traumatic background that some of the individuals that were resettled here in the United States experienced prior to coming here.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about when you're talking about language justice, like what that encompasses?
Of course, yeah. I will give you a quick example that I experienced myself. A few years back, I needed to get a car seat checked. So I contacted my local police department and we inquired about getting the car seat checked. I was instructed by the officer to come on a Sunday, given that it's a quiet day, and they will be able to assist me with that. When I arrived to the police station, I felt hesitant to get out of my vehicle, given that there was no one but me outside the police station. Took me a while. I went back to the email, tried to find the phone number, and I was able to successfully contact the police officer that I'm scheduled with. And she gave me instructions to come to the back and she will open the door and get the car seat checked. After that, I had a lovely conversation with the officer. She was very passionate for the work that she's doing, and I had a great experience. So, in my mind, as I was leaving the police station, what made me feel that way? What made me feel uncomfortable? And reflecting on my experience growing up in the Middle East, police were not the friendly bunch that you will go to and seek their help if you need help. That led me to trying to do something about it for my own healing, but also to do something for my own community, the community that I live in. So I had the privilege and opportunity to partner with F&M College and the Police Chiefs Association to provide services around training police officers on how to engage and learn about refugee and immigrants in the Lancaster County, and also create opportunities for us to have leaders and have community representatives meet with police officers and share their concerns and get to meet police officers outside the emergency mode. So that's a simple practice that we do with intentionality to make sure that we are providing services that will be beneficial to the service provider, but also mainly to the community that we are all part of.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think you helped to identify that the really vital collaborative space where trauma-informed care lives, with individuals and in our community, where it's these intersection points where the different events in our lives, can show up in different ways. Yeah, Alex, one question that I have is, would you be able to share an example where a cross-sector kind of collaboration helped you in your work in addressing trauma more effectively?
Yeah, so I think this kind of has been highlighted by a couple of panelists in terms of just that intersectionality of everyone's experiences that we're all working with. It would be very simple to say, okay, we'll just address this from the school end, right? We'll just address this from this one group. However, these families, these students that we're working with, or whoever your clientele is, they have multiple systems that are impacting their lives. And that was kind of that model I shared in my presentation. So that cross-sector collaboration piece is huge because they're being impacted by all of those different areas. So then we need to address it in all of those different areas. Otherwise, the one solution coming from one individual or one system is not going to work with that. So in a school setting, it's a perfect example. And we have kids, we have families that are obviously the students are living with. And then we have all of the different people in the school that they're interacting with, but also, they might be seeing a mental health provider that's outside of our school. They might be seeing a physical health provider outside the school. They may be working with their faith community. They may be working with other nonprofits for homelessness or poverty, like Community Action Partnership or something like that. All of these groups, we need to come together and make sure that we're all on the same page, because one of the issues with, or one of the challenges that comes up with trauma is this feeling of out of control, right? So if we can provide some of that control back, like communicating to these families, hey, can we set up a meeting, reduce that barrier of them having to go to 3 different places, everyone get on the same page with what their needs are, we may be able to address it a lot better collectively than we would individually. And that's not just to say that we're duplicating services. Some of that is, we may be able to address something for them. I'm thinking for students, in a school, if they're having a bullying challenge, right, between them and another student. But we may not be able to address the issue of transportation for them to get to their medical appointments. So us working with maybe a social worker that can assist them with setting up either public transportation, or we've also helped families get Uber cards to get to medical appointments. So looking at, how can we all get on the same page to address those challenges, that might then also lead into some of the issues that they're facing in school, right? So if they're not able to get to their medical appointments, now they're coming in late because they had to figure out some other way to get there. Grandmom had to drive from across town to take them to LGH in time. So if we can address those, it might address some of the challenges that we're facing in the school.
Thanks. Karen, in your work, training and equipping our next generation of connected social workers, like how do you go about preparing students to function and work in these intersectional spaces and addressing trauma in our community?
Yeah, so Joe, I think it's, we look at it across levels, right? The individual level, the group level, and then the macro kind of community organizational level. But first, having a good understanding and grasp of what trauma-informed care is, which really is that framework for understanding that nexus between our childhood experiences, right, and a current presenting challenges, and then helping students understand how early trauma can be a possible explanation for when they're trying to understand and conceptualize kind of current individual behavior. And so the focus really is to shift away from this focus on pathology and move more towards a perspective of strength and well-being, so that any negative views of the current functioning of individuals, we can reframe that into like survival strategies. These are the individual's survival strategies that emerged in response to some early adversity. So having that framework and that understanding of, like why people behave the way they do, right? And connecting it back to these early childhood experiences, which Alex highlighted earlier at the start of the webinar, I think is foundational, and then provide them with the tools. What are those then trauma-informed practices that align with this framework? At an individual level, that you might use the trauma resiliency model, right, and teach them those skills of how we help individuals decrease their body's stress response to trauma. That includes practical strategies such as helping individuals learn how to emotionally regulate, right? How do they cope? How do they build healthy social connections? How do they learn to reframe new experiences that they might have? And then obviously building that empathy and compassion is foundational in helping individuals through that healing process. You know, I think at the community level, right, the organizational level, it's really helping organizations build that leadership, make sure that there is that leadership that's educated around the science of trauma. Because if they want to create that workspace that's going to be healthy for their individuals and foster that post-traumatic growth, they need to understand trauma and the effects that it has on their employees. And then how can they create these trauma responsive environments? How can they build, you know, environments that foster trust and psychological safety? Fostering, you know, that just some basic skills of like listening and to understand rather than to respond, model that healthy behavior, take a review, a deep dive into reviewing existing policies and where might those policies, you know, I think as Amer stated, that language justice. I love that. I love that terminology. You know, I said trauma responsive language, but I love the language justice terminology. But it's really looking at our policies and where might we need to change some of that language so that it's not triggering and it's not, you know, trauma. So that it aligns with trauma response approaches.
But we have a question that's come from the audience that I want to turn to next, which I think is an extension of the things that you were just talking about, Karen. Yeah, and this is for the panel. And the question is, where are we at as a community on requirements for businesses, doctors' offices, schools, et cetera, to be required to have trauma training and require, you know, and yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Like, so like where are we in our community broadly around this?
I wanted to touch on 2 points. You know, some of the things that Dr. Rice mentioned, and I also want to respond to that question. So I'm gonna try to respond to that question, and maybe like, you know, if we have time, I will expand on some of the things that I experienced working and helping, you know, people in our community. But one of the things that I, you know, notice sometimes there is, you know, some challenges around, you know, the why. Why should we do this? We don't have the time for this. We don't have the budget for it. And I felt like, you know, when we're doing like, you know, some of the language justice work in our community, we do offer, you know, sometimes like complimentary services to new partners or like to opportunities that arise to allow us like to share such concepts with the community. And I found it like I found it to be very beneficial to organizations when they hear you know, from a neutral party and they sit in a room where they learn about a topic or a concept that they might not were aware of before. And that opens up a lot of doors. So you might see some resistance in the beginning, like, why should we do this? And what is the reason behind this? But once people learn, or organizations and, you know, management learn about a new concept and they feel like that they can make an educated response or decision based on the information that they gained, then you will see that there is less resistance to making changes. And, you know, as humans, we all resist change, and that's part of our nature.
Thanks. Yeah, we can want to hopefully circle back to that like in a few minutes. Jessica, in your work with Lancaster County Chooses Love, what are some examples of particular approaches that, you know, that your organization takes in reaching out to the community in this trauma-informed way?
That is a good question. So when we're talking about working with individuals, you know, I'm going to speak mostly for myself, but our entire leadership team has similar thoughts on this topic. But I begin with being mindful that I'm not going to know what, if any, traumas a person has experienced or is currently healing through. And so when we're communicating with people, we're watching for signs that what we're saying or doing are having an impact that is not what we intend. And when we see that that we're having those unintended responses, we start pausing and asking questions to help us understand those reactions. Because if we don't understand the reactions that someone is having from a trauma reaction, we can't really engage with them appropriately. So when someone discloses a trauma or is using language that makes me believe that they might be reacting from a place of trauma, because they might not even recognize it in themselves, we work to create space for people to express themselves. We acknowledge what they're sharing with us, and we do our best to communicate that we're going to support them in whatever way they need as we move forward in that conversation or in that relationship. And sometimes that's the sharing of resources that we provide or sharing resources that another community organization provides. Sometimes it's just, being there and giving them a place to share. And when we talk about, how we engage in creating community, we have to start with acknowledging which organizations and businesses that have historically caused harm, and make sure that we're not partnering with those organizations or places unless they're really have done the hard work of addressing that harm. And so, while we value the support of affirming congregations, one of the things that I encourage our leadership team to consider is that we're careful in when and how frequently we use some of those spaces. Because for some of us, myself included, just entering even an affirming church comes with a lot of emotional labor. We have to manage our religious traumas in those spaces. And so by being mindful when we're creating community, we can better balance the traumas of our community, the experiences, the trauma experiences that we may have had, with rebuilding and healing relationships with those who may have been the source of that trauma. And so that's the kind of mindset that I bring to this. It's a mindset that's, shared in many ways with other members of our leadership in the organization.
And the word that really sticks out to me is mindful. And thanks for raising that to our attention. Kelly, as we're moving in toward the end of our conversation time and moving into some around bigger question of what can we do and approaches we can take, that how can we engage, and how can we engage with law enforcement, and law enforcement engage with the wider public in ways that build trust and bring approach our engagement from this trauma-informed place? What are some specific recommendations and approaches that you have for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think one way is through routine positive contact. So I'm sure, as many people can imagine, as a police social worker and, as law enforcement, we're not always interacting with people when they're having the best day of their lives. So I think being intentional of making those connections with community members outside of maybe incidents that are occurring. Some specifics: our department has a really close relationship with places like the Food Hub, Arch Street, and Anchor Breakfast, to name a few. These are local agencies that provide support to the community on a routine basis. I think another thing that we can do specifically is humanizing our interactions, which I think we've touched on a little bit. So this includes being empathetic, using active listening, just to ensure that people feel seen and heard. Having empathy by understanding the perspective of others is key to being trauma informed. And I think we did a great job of touching on that today. And these strategies can help create a safe place where people know that we care and are here for them, regardless of our job titles, but just as one human to another.
Yeah, and I want to keep talking about empathy. Rebecca, in your work with the Lancaster County Food Hub, how does empathy show up in the work that your organization does, both as an organization itself and in partnership with others?
I think this is something that Jessica had already said, and Kelly as well, right? To the welcoming environment, and what does that look like for our community? What does the empathy look like? For us, it's a physical space, right? Where we're a social service agency where our neighbors can come in. So how do we work on that to make sure that it is a welcoming environment, since it's so crucial for success and fostering healing? With that, non-stigmatizing services, a place where individuals don't feel shamed for needing assistance, for coming in. That's a really strong focus that we have here.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit more about like how that, how that kind of approach, like that builds pathways for, for hope and, and directly improving people's lives?
Sure, absolutely. Building strong relationships with neighbors and community is something that, again, we're super focused on. It's something that we see that is lacking, even within the trauma resilience, right? You often feel very isolated, lonely, not able to have a place where you can come and share. So I think that's really what we're trying to get through.
Yeah, for the whole panel, do you have specific, like, do you have specific advice about next steps that our audience can look at taking as we continue learning more and put what we learn into action?
I will start the group and I will say like building trust is a key. On knowing that my way is not the only way. People will view things from their own perspective based on their prior experiences and make their decision based on that. And we've heard that evident today from like the different panels that we were with us today. So take a step back and try to make sense of the situation that you are involved in to help yourself fully understand the situation and hopefully provide better services for the people that you're engaging.
That's a really good response, Amer. I'd like to share on this one as well. I think one of the first steps that people should take is acknowledging that everyone is exposed to traumatizing experiences at some point, and to follow that up by extending grace to each other when we experience a trauma trigger, and respond before we regain ourselves, because so often we don't recognize that we're responding from a place of trauma and we just react. And so there needs to be grace for that. And like was shared in the presentation, it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. But allowing that grace is what allows us to move through that trauma, heal through that trauma, and create community through that trauma.
Well said. I was gonna say something very similar, Jessica, but healing occurs when we have this shared humanity, right? Because it helps us, helps individuals feel validated, understood, and valued. So key is like just ask questions, come from a place of genuine concern and authenticity and interest in the individual, like withhold judgment, don't assume. So that allows us to build trust in these interpersonal relationships, that the respect, the collaboration, the compassion, the genuineness that we exhibit and we demonstrate for another human being allows others then to have hope and trust in others and really believe that there are compassionate people out there.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those steps that we can start, and coming from that place of curiosity and wanting to learn from each other about what that experience is, that's such an important foundation. We've reached the end of our time already. I want to express my thanks and gratitude to Alex for his presentation and participation in the panel, and thanks to Amer and Jessica and Karen and Kelly and Rebecca for the wisdom and insights that you've shared with us over the course of our time today. Thank you to our audience for joining. Thank you for your participation and for your questions. Please watch for the follow-up email that will come later this week that will have links to YouTube and Spotify recordings of this conversation and links to other resources. Thank you to our United Way marketing and communications team for making the Zoom and the technology happen. And please visit United Way of Lancaster County on the web. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube and on Threads to find out more about our upcoming events and ways that you can get involved in our community. We value all the work that you all do in our community and making it a better place and improving the lives of others around us every day. Thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.